The last viral video ended the way so many people expected it to end. A quiet wave, a soft goodbye, a sense that the story had been told and that whatever happened next would finally be private. Millions watched, shared, debated, and then moved on. Timelines refreshed. New stories replaced old ones. But for the Whittaker family, nothing actually ended when a camera stopped recording. What ended was the noise. What followed was something far heavier. In the weeks after that final upload, the house didn't suddenly transform into a place of peace or clarity. The porch didn't feel warmer. The silence didn't feel earned. It felt uncertain. The kind of silence that makes people look over their shoulders and wonder who is still watching and who might show up next. Betty stayed where she always had been, surrounded by the same walls, the same memories, and a growing confusion about what was real and who could be trusted. For viewers, the story froze in time. For the family, it unraveled. The attention that once felt like help quickly became pressure. Donations had slowed, but the questions hadn't. Neighbors noticed fewer visitors and fewer cars driving up the hill. The road that once felt busy with outsiders filming and delivering supplies became quiet again. People assumed quiet meant stability. It didn't. It meant isolation layered on top of exhaustion. Betty began asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Where did the money go? Who was actually in charge? Why were people arguing online about her life when she hadn't asked them to? She heard names repeated over and over, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted through phone screens. None of it felt like help anymore. It felt like her life had been split into pieces and passed around by strangers. Timmy sensed a shift long before anyone explained it to him. His routines changed. The faces coming and going weren't familiar. He didn't understand why some people who once acted like family suddenly disappeared. He didn't understand why others talked about him like he wasn't standing right there. That confusion settled into restlessness. He wandered more. He asked fewer questions. He grew quieter in ways that worried people who actually knew him. Lorraine withdrew. She spent more time watching instead of talking. She noticed tension the way people who have lived their whole lives in instability do. She felt it before it was spoken. Ray stayed where he always stayed, but the care around him became more inconsistent. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because everything around them was unstable. Help that arrives without structure rarely stays long enough to build anything lasting. Online, the story took on a life of its own. People argued about who had helped the most and who had hurt the family the worst. Screenshots circulated. Claims were made. Defenses were posted. Each new post claimed to finally explain what really happened. None of them actually lived inside that house. The Whittakers didn't understand the scale of what was happening outside their property. They only felt the consequences. Phones rang less. Promises became vague. Plans stopped sounding real. And the idea that everything would be fixed soon slowly faded into something no one wanted to say out loud anymore. Then came the visits that didn't involve cameras. Cars with official markings pulled up the road. Conversations happened that weren't filmed. Questions were asked in ways that didn't feel optional. People who had spent years living under public judgment suddenly found themselves under formal scrutiny. The difference was subtle but devastating. Online criticism could be ignored. This couldn't. Betty struggled to understand why strangers who had watched her for years were now deciding what was best for her family. She had survived poverty, ridicule, and isolation. She didn't see herself as someone who needed saving. She saw herself as someone who had always endured. That distinction mattered to her, even if it didn't matter to systems designed around rules instead of relationships. The family didn't have the language to explain themselves in ways that satisfied outside expectations. They answered honestly, but honesty doesn't always translate into safety when systems are involved. What felt normal to them sounded alarming to people trained to see risk. What felt like love sounded like neglect when described without context. Decisions were made quickly, faster than anyone expected, faster than the family could emotionally process. When people were removed from the home, it didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like loss. There was no dramatic confrontation, no clear explanation that made sense to everyone involved. One day, people were there. The next day, they weren't. The house felt hollow in ways it never had before, even during the hardest years. For viewers watching from afar, the updates were confusing and inconsistent. Some creators claimed everything was necessary. Others claimed it was betrayal. Supporters turned on each other. Everyone insisted they care the most. Very few people asked what the family wanted in the middle of all that noise. Betty stopped speaking publicly altogether. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she no longer trusted that her words would be heard the way she meant them. Every sentence became something someone else would interpret, edit, or weaponize. Silence felt safer than being misunderstood again. The house became a symbol instead of a home. People talked about it like a case study or a cautionary tale. Few talked about it like a place where people had laughed, fought, forgiven, and survived together for decades. Fewer still remembered that none of this started because the family asked for attention. They were filmed. They were watched. They were judged. And when the watching stopped, the systems moved in. What happened after the last viral video wasn't closure. It was exposure without protection, attention without accountability, help without coordination. And once the spotlight moved on, the family was left to deal with consequences that couldn't be shared, donated away, or argued out in comment sections. The hardest part isn't knowing that mistakes were made. It's knowing that everyone involved believed, at least at some point, that they were doing the right thing. Good intentions don't always produce good outcomes, especially when they collide with poverty, trauma, and public spectacle. The Whittaker story didn't end when the video did. It changed shape. It moved out of the public eye and into offices, files, and quiet rooms where decisions are final and explanations are limited. For the family, that shift was disorienting. For the audience, it felt like abandonment. And now the question isn't who is right or wrong online. The question is what responsibility comes with watching a family suffer in real time and calling it awareness. What happens when curiosity outpaces care? What happens when help becomes performance and performance becomes power? Because once the cameras leave, the consequences stay. And the people who live with them don't get to log out. If you followed this story from the beginning, what do you think really changed after the last viral video? And who do you believe was truly looking out for the family when the attention faded? Comment below. After the last viral video faded from people's feeds, the story didn't pause. It fragmented. What had once been a single narrative told through one lens became dozens of competing versions told by people who claimed proximity, authority, or moral clarity. And in that fragmentation, the Whittaker family lost something more important than attention. They lost control over their own story. In the early days after the cameras stopped, there was still an assumption among supporters that help was ongoing. Many believed money was being managed responsibly, plans were being finalized, and that silence simply meant work was happening behind the scenes. That belief didn't come from evidence. It came from trust built during the viral phase, when every update felt urgent and every promise felt personal. But behind the scenes, coordination had already begun to break down. There was no single organization overseeing donations, no transparent system that the family understood, no clear separation between advocacy, content creation, and financial responsibility. Everything existed in a gray zone where intentions blurred with incentives. For the Whittakers, who had never navigated digital platforms, contracts, or public fundraising before, this world was overwhelming. They relied on others to interpret it for them. That reliance became their greatest vulnerability. As disagreements between helpers escalated, the family became the silent center of a loud conflict. Names were mentioned around them. Accusations were referenced without explanation. People who had once stood together began issuing statements that directly contradicted each other. One person would claim funds were secured. Another would claim funds were missing. Each side insisted the other was lying, and each claimed the family supported them. But the family didn't have the capacity to verify any of it. Betty listened. She nodded. She trusted whoever was physically present in that moment. And when those people changed, her understanding changed with them. That wasn't manipulation on her part. It was survival. When your world has always been small and interpersonal, you trust the voice in front of you more than the argument happening somewhere you can't see. Timmy felt the tension in ways he couldn't articulate. He didn't understand money, platforms, or accusations. What he understood was inconsistency. One week someone promised to take him somewhere. The next week that person was gone. He understood raised voices. He understood when adults were stressed. And he understood when the environment around him became unpredictable. Lorraine internalized everything. She had lived her entire life responding to instability by becoming quieter, smaller, less visible. As the conflict intensified, she retreated further into herself. Outsiders interpreted that silence in different ways. Some saw it as compliance. Others saw it as fear. Very few recognized it as exhaustion. Ray's care became a point of debate among people who rarely saw him in person. Online discussions dissected his condition, his hygiene, and his quality of life as if he were a concept instead of a person. But care is not something that improves through discourse alone. It requires consistency, resources, and trust. All three were eroding at the same time. As the disagreements became public, so did the pressure. Agencies don't operate in isolation. They respond to reports, patterns, and documentation. When online conflicts spill into real-world concerns, systems take notice. Calls are logged. Screenshots are saved. Videos are reviewed. And context is often lost in the process. What may have felt like advocacy to some began to look like risk to others. When officials began asking questions, the family didn't know how to answer in a way that aligned with expectations. They answered honestly, but honesty without context can sound alarming. Describing lifelong routines to someone trained to identify neglect can trigger intervention, even when those routines were never questioned before. The family didn't understand that the rules had changed. For decades, their lives had been invisible. Suddenly, they were hypervisible. And with visibility came scrutiny that didn't account for history, culture, or adaptation. What had been survival strategies were now seen as failures. What had been informal caregiving was now seen as inadequate supervision. The removal didn't feel like help to the family. It felt abrupt and confusing. There were no long explanations that made sense to them. There was no roadmap they could follow to get back to normal. There was only absence. Online, reactions were immediate and intense. Some celebrated, claiming justice had been done. Others mourned, claiming the family had been torn apart unnecessarily. Each side spoke with certainty. Neither side lived with the consequences. Betty didn't understand why people who claimed to care were now arguing about who caused the removal instead of focusing on what happened next. She didn't know who to believe. She only knew that her home was quieter than it had ever been, and that quiet didn't feel like relief. The house itself became a symbol of failure. People talked about it as if it were proof of wrongdoing, forgetting that it had stood for decades without intervention. The sudden urgency raised questions that no one could answer cleanly. Why now? Why after years of visibility? Why after donations and attention peaked? The family didn't ask those questions out loud. They didn't know who to ask. As weeks passed, updates became sporadic and unreliable. Each new post contradicted the last. Some claimed reunification was imminent. Others claimed permanent separation. Some claimed the family was safer than ever. Others claimed irreparable harm had been done. In reality, the truth was far less dramatic and far more painful. The family was navigating a system they didn't understand, without advocates they could fully trust, while being discussed by thousands of people who would never meet them. Betty's world narrowed again, but this time it wasn't by choice. The attention that once felt intrusive now felt distant. She had gone from being watched constantly to being spoken about constantly without being present. That shift was disempowering in a way she couldn't articulate. And for the audience, the lack of clear answers created frustration. People wanted closure. They wanted someone to blame. They wanted a conclusion that made the emotional investment feel worthwhile. But real lives don't resolve on schedule, and trauma doesn't wrap itself neatly for consumption. What really happened after the last viral video wasn't a single event. It was a cascade, a slow collapse of structure, trust, and clarity. A reminder that attention without infrastructure can do more harm than good. And a lesson in how quickly good intentions can spiral when they're not grounded in accountability. The Whittaker family didn't need to be saved by strangers. They needed consistent support, clear boundaries, and advocates who understood both their needs and the systems around them. Instead, they became the center of a conflict that outgrew them. And now, as the noise fades again, they are left carrying consequences they never agreed to. If you've been following this story, do you think the attention ultimately helped the Whittakers, or did it accelerate the breakdown that led to their separation? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the weeks turned into months, the most damaging part of the aftermath wasn't the investigation, the arguments, or even the separation itself. It was the vacuum left behind. In that vacuum, speculation replaced facts, loyalty replaced accountability, and the Whittaker family became a symbol instead of a group of people still trying to survive day to day. The system moved slowly once the initial intervention was complete. That slowness created space for narratives to grow unchecked. Some people insisted the family was finally receiving proper care. Others insisted the intervention was an overreach that punished poverty rather than neglect. Both sides spoke loudly, but neither side had full access to the truth. Case details were sealed. Locations were undisclosed. Communication was limited by law, not by choice. For the Whittakers, the lack of information felt like abandonment layered on top of loss. Betty was left in a position she had never occupied before. For most of her life, she had been the constant, the one who stayed, the one who kept the household running in whatever way she knew how. Suddenly, decisions were being made without her input, about people she loved, by systems she didn't understand. Every day brought new questions she couldn't answer. Were they sleeping? Are they eating what they like? Do they think I gave up on them? No one could give her reassurance that felt real. The people who had once spoken on her behalf were now focused on defending themselves. Explanations turned inward. Statements became about clearing names, correcting narratives, and justifying actions. The family's needs became secondary to the battle over who was right and who was responsible. That shift was subtle but devastating. Timmy's absence was the hardest for Betty to process. His presence had been woven into her daily rhythm. The sound of him moving around the house, his voice calling out, the small routines that anchored her sense of purpose. Without him, time stretched uncomfortably. Days felt longer, emptier. She wasn't just missing a person. She was missing a role she had played for decades. Lorraine's silence weighed differently. Betty worried not because Lorraine was loud, but because she wasn't. She feared Lorraine would disappear into herself in a place where no one knew her cues, her habits, her quiet signals of distress. Betty had learned those over a lifetime. She didn't trust that strangers could read them the same way. Ray's care had always been physically demanding, but emotionally grounding. Caring for him was difficult, but it gave structure to Betty's days. Without that responsibility, she felt unmoored. The house felt too large and too small at the same time. Outside the family, the online discourse continued to escalate. Every pause in updates was interpreted as proof of wrongdoing. Silence was treated as guilt. Nuance disappeared entirely. People chose sides based on which explanation aligned with their existing beliefs, not on evidence. Donors demanded answers. Some wanted refunds. Others wanted justice. A few wanted apologies. But most wanted reassurance that their good intentions hadn't been wasted. That need for reassurance fueled even more speculation, because clear accounting wasn't readily available. Part of the problem was structural. Donations had been spread across platforms, accounts, and informal channels. Some money had been spent directly on supplies. Some had gone to travel. Some had gone to housing-related costs that never materialized. Without centralized oversight, reconstructing the full picture was nearly impossible. That confusion became fertile ground for mistrust. Meanwhile, the Whittakers themselves had little understanding of how much money had been raised in their name. They didn't track totals. They didn't manage accounts. They judged support by what arrived physically. Groceries, clothes, repairs that either happened or didn't. When people asked them about large sums, they couldn't reconcile those numbers with their lived reality. That gap made them appear complicit to some observers, when in reality, it highlighted how disconnected they were from the mechanisms being used on their behalf. As scrutiny intensified, some people who had once been vocal supporters quietly disappeared. Accounts went inactive. Videos were deleted. Past statements were scrubbed. That erasure raised even more questions. If nothing was wrong, why vanish? If everything was misunderstood, why not stay and clarify? But staying meant enduring harassment, threats, and relentless questioning. For many, it wasn't worth it. The family didn't have that option. They couldn't log off. What followed was a period of limbo. Reunification discussions stalled. Assessments took time. Paperwork moved slowly. Each delay felt like confirmation to outsiders that something terrible must have been uncovered. In reality, it was bureaucracy functioning as it always does, inefficiently and impersonally. For Betty, each delay felt like punishment without explanation. She replayed conversations in her head, wondering what she had said wrong, what she should have said differently. She questioned her own memory. She questioned whether loving her family the way she always had was now considered a failure. No one explained the standards she was being measured against. She only knew she hadn't met them. The internet rarely considers how interventions feel from the inside. There were moments of hope, occasional updates that suggested progress, hints that visits might be allowed. But those moments were fragile, easily overshadowed by the next wave of online outrage. Each rumor felt heavier than the last because it reminded the family that their story was no longer theirs to tell. What made everything worse was the absence of a trusted, neutral advocate, someone who understood the family and the system, someone who could translate expectations in both directions. Without that bridge, misunderstandings multiplied. People often assume that intervention automatically improves outcomes. That removal equals safety. That oversight equals care. But systems are only as effective as the resources behind them. And resources are often stretched thin. The Whittakers didn't move into a better story. They moved into uncertainty. For viewers, that uncertainty was unsatisfying. Stories are supposed to resolve. Heroes are supposed to be vindicated. Villains are supposed to be exposed. But reality doesn't conform to narrative structure. It drifts. It complicates. It refuses to provide clean endings. And so frustration turned into fatigue. As attention waned, fewer people checked for updates. The comments section slowed. New controversies took center stage. The Whittakers faded back into obscurity, but not the kind they had before. This obscurity was heavier because it came after exposure. Being unseen after being seen is a unique kind of loss. What really happened after the last viral video wasn't a conclusion. It was a reckoning, a demonstration of how quickly attention can turn into pressure and how poorly systems respond when private lives are made public without preparation. The family didn't emerge stronger. They emerged fragmented, confused, and grieving a version of normal they could never return to. And the audience was left with an uncomfortable realization. Wanting to help isn't the same as knowing how. Caring isn't the same as protecting. And watching isn't the same as understanding. Do you think the outcome would have been different if the Whittakers had been supported quietly instead of publicly, or was intervention inevitable once the internet became involved? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the time the noise finally began to fade, what remained was not clarity, justice, or closure, but consequences. Quiet ones. The kind that don't trend, don't generate outrage, and don't attract viewers. The kind that settle into people's lives and stay there. For the Whittaker family, the aftermath of the last viral video marked the end of one kind of exposure and the beginning of another kind of struggle. The cameras were gone, but the impact of having been filmed, discussed, judged, and dissected did not disappear with them. It followed them into every interaction with the system, every conversation with officials, every attempt to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Betty's world had shrunk. Where once her days were filled with movement, voices, and responsibilities, now they were punctuated by waiting. Waiting for calls, waiting for permission, waiting for answers that came slowly, if at all. She learned quickly that the system did not move at the pace of human grief. It moved according to procedures, assessments, and timelines that felt arbitrary to someone who had never lived by them before. She was told to be patient, to trust the process. Words that sound reasonable until you're the one being asked to surrender control over the people you love most. Her sense of guilt deepened in that waiting. Guilt not because she believed she had intentionally harmed anyone, but because she felt she had failed in ways she couldn't quite define. Poverty had always been part of her life. Scrutiny had not. Suddenly, the things she had normalized for decades were being evaluated under standards she had never been taught to meet. No one explained how to bridge that gap. They simply measured it. Timmy's absence left a hole that could not be filled by reassurance. Betty worried constantly about whether he understood what was happening or whether he believed he had been abandoned. She replayed their last moments together, searching for signs she might have missed, something she could have said differently. In her mind, the separation replayed endlessly, never resolving. Lorraine's situation haunted her in quieter ways. Betty feared Lorraine's voice would be lost in environments that weren't built to listen for it. She feared that Lorraine's needs would be misunderstood or overlooked simply because they didn't present themselves loudly. That fear was exhausting because there was nothing she could do to act on it. Ray's removal carried a different weight. Caring for him had been physically demanding, but it had given Betty purpose. Without that role, she struggled to define herself. She wasn't just grieving the absence of her family. She was grieving the loss of her identity as their caretaker. The system rarely accounts for that kind of loss. Meanwhile, the broader story continued to fracture. What had once been a shared concern splintered into competing explanations. Some insisted the intervention had saved lives. Others insisted it had destroyed a family. Both sides spoke as if certainty was possible, as if the truth could be fully known from a distance. But distance was the problem. Most of the people arguing had never sat in that house without a camera present. They had never watched Betty navigate daily life without assistance. They had never seen how survival choices compound over decades. They interpreted snapshots as patterns and moments as intentions. In that way, the Whittaker story became less about what actually happened and more about what people needed it to represent. For some, it was proof that the system works. For others, proof that it fails. For some, it was about exploitation by creators. For others, about neglect within families. The truth likely lived somewhere in the overlap, but overlap is uncomfortable. It doesn't lend itself to certainty or outrage, so it was largely ignored. Donors continued to ask about money, but their questions slowly lost urgency as time passed. Some accepted that they would never get full answers. Others decided the emotional cost of continuing to care was too high. They moved on, not because they stopped caring, but because caring without resolution is draining. That quiet disengagement was one of the most significant outcomes of the entire saga. When attention vanished, so did pressure. When pressure vanished, accountability became harder to demand. Systems function best when watched, but people rarely keep watching once a story stops evolving. The Whittakers didn't benefit from that invisibility. It didn't protect them. It didn't restore what they lost. It simply meant fewer people were paying attention to whether things improved. Over time, the narrative shifted subtly. The family went from being in need to being a complicated case. From victims to a cautionary tale. Language matters. Those shifts changed how people spoke about them and how willing they were to continue advocating. Complexity is less compelling than simplicity. There were no dramatic reunions, no sweeping reforms, no definitive statements clearing names or assigning blame. Just incremental changes, small steps forward and backward, each too quiet to generate headlines. That lack of resolution frustrated many viewers. Stories are supposed to end. They're supposed to teach something clear. But real lives don't function that way. They meander. They stall. They repeat mistakes. They survive without transforming. The Whittaker family didn't become a success story or a tragedy. They became something far more common and far less interesting to the internet. People living with the consequences of systems colliding with vulnerability. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about what happened after the last viral video. Nothing ended. The filming stopped, but the impacts continued. The conversations faded, but the decisions made during that period continued to shape lives. The outrage cooled, but the loss remained. For Betty, the hardest part wasn't being judged. It was being forgotten. Being judged at least meant people were paying attention. Being forgotten meant she was alone with questions no one else seemed interested in answering anymore. Occasionally, someone would reach out quietly, not with a camera, not with demands, just to check in. Those moments mattered more than any viral campaign ever had. They reminded her that care doesn't need an audience to be real. But those moments were rare. The broader lesson of the Whittaker story isn't about one creator, one intervention, or one decision. It's about what happens when private suffering becomes public content without safeguards. When good intentions collide with poor planning. When attention substitutes for infrastructure. The internet is very good at identifying problems. It is very bad at sustaining solutions. What really happened after the last viral video is that a family learned how conditional public concern can be. How quickly empathy turns into opinion. How easily help becomes harm when it isn't coordinated, accountable, and centered on the people it claims to serve. There are no villains twirling mustaches in this story. There are people who made mistakes. People who overestimated their ability to help. People who underestimated the consequences of exposure. And a family who paid the price for all of it. The question now isn't who is right or wrong. It's what we do differently next time. Because there will be a next time. Another family. Another viral moment. Another rush to help without a plan to sustain. If anything meaningful is to come from the Whittaker family's experience, it won't be found in rehashing blame. It will be found in asking harder questions before the cameras ever turn on. Who is responsible when the attention fades? Who protects vulnerable people from becoming symbols? Who ensures that help doesn't collapse into chaos? Those questions matter far more than any update ever could. What do you think is the biggest lesson from what happened after the last viral video? And do you believe the internet can ever truly help families like the Whittakers without causing harm? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.